me make sure everything is on silent. Yeah, right? It doesn't work all right.
All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. It's a small, intimate group today, which will make it even more fun. But anyway, hello. I think I know many of you, but my name is Caroline. I'm a naturalist at Chik-Wauk. And I just wanted to start us off by giving a shout out to our sponsors, Visit Cook County and the Gunflint Trail Association. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to host all of these series of speakers that we have today and into the summer. So we have even more. It's mostly on Sundays, usually one a week, but you can check online. And we also, Sherilyn has the newsletter with a printed list of all of our upcoming talks coming up. Next week on Sunday at 2 o'clock right here in the Nature Center, Maddie Nisler is going to be coming from the Loon Center, the National Loon Center in Cross Lake, and sharing some cool stuff on loons. So that'll be next week here at the Nature Center. So yeah, but anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Today we have Sam Guida here, and he is going to be telling us all about gulls, burls, and brooms. He currently works at Camp Olson YMCA, which is a Y camp that's located in Longville, Minnesota, and he does facilities and maintenance there. But even longer than he's worked there, he's been interested in lumps on plants. He first got interested in gulls in 2019 when he found a lump on a willow tree that he found out was a beaked willow gull midge. Okay, yeah, I got that right. And ever since then, he has been looking at lumps on leaves and spots on twigs and learning all about them. So we'll let him do the rest of the teaching. But yeah, so welcome, Sam.
Sweet. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. For everyone in back, if I'm ever not loud enough, feel free to let me know that you'd like me to be louder. As well as, you know, it's a nice small group, and so if there's a slide you want to look at a little bit more in depth, and also because we're a little bit smaller, we can ask a few more questions. So throughout my slide, I'm going to have quite a few kind of like pivot points here where they'll show us, you know, what we're doing, what the next thing we're going to be talking about is. And if you have a question that pops up, feel free to raise your hand during these slides, and we can address that question and get, you know, your curiosity answered before we roll on to our next step. So, Carol did a great job at introducing me. Like she said, my name is Sam. I use he, him, his. And I got interested in gulls while working at Wolf Ridge Environmental Learning Center. I knew about gulls beforehand. I grew up on a small farm in Nisswa, and you know, every once in a while I'd be out with my grandpa and he would point one out, especially the ones that were in goldenrod. You know, they form the huge lump in the middle of the goldenrod that almost looks like someone, you know, shoved a ping pong ball down in there. And there were a couple others underneath oak trees that were bright red that we used to collect because he didn't think the cows should eat them. And so he'd drive me out to the spot that there were a whole bunch of them. He'd have me gather all of them, and then we'd keep going. And, you know, I didn't really think about it other than sometimes you cut them open, you're like, oh, there's a bug in there. But they're just part of the natural world. And then I got really into plants. And it was the middle of winter at Wolf Ridge. We had about 3 feet of snow, and I had run out of plants to look at because they were all either buried or, you know, the last couple little stragglers were sticking above the snow, and I've been seeing the same hazel and balsam and spruce over and over and over again. And I was getting pretty bored with the few plants that I could find. And then I ran across what Carol said was a funny little lump on a twig, and I was like, huh, that's not quite right. That looks weird. I sliced it open, and there's a little orange grub inside. I went, oh, that's wild. And so I started working on it, trying to ID it. And back then there weren't a lot of resources that you could actually use to find the ID source of what it was. And it took quite a bit of digging, and I found out it was the willow-beaked gull midge. They form something that's about that long, and then the actual insect when it hatches is about that long. I was like, huh, that's interesting. And that could have been where it stopped, but a couple days later we were skiing up in Isabella, and I came across a pine cone on a willow, and I went, that's a deciduous plant. There aren't supposed to be pine cones on them. And I dove a little bit deeper again, and it turned out it was the willow pine cone gull midge, and I went, oh, there's another gull? And then the slippery slope started after that, and I've been doing it, you know, on and off ever since. So that leads us to the question of what is a gull. So a gull is an abnormal plant growth that's caused by a various parasite. They're generally called gull inducers. And they're very similar to like a cyst on a plant where they're relatively benign. The inducers can be from a wide variety of different things. They can be from viruses, funguses, but most often they're caused by insects. Gull-inducing insects come from every walk of life, and they're a great example of convergent evolution, where they have wasps, midges, aphids, sawflies, psyllids, mites, all sorts of different things, including moths, are all learning to live within these plants. That brings us into a further question of if they're living in there, how do they get there, and what causes the plant to look so weird around it? And why would you be in this plant in the first place? So gulls are generally caused by the inducer laying their eggs within the host plant. The larva then hatches and they live within the growth plant and they're feeding on it and they're creating a small home in it. But this causes some really wild reactions. First up, they're feeding on the plant itself, causes it to grow a little bit funky and a little bit weird. And so it's known that some mechanisms for gull formation are caused by the actual feeding of the insects. However, it gets a little bit weirder and a little bit funkier, where many gull-inducing insects are known to secrete plant-mimic growth hormones. So somehow evolution has figured out that this little tiny insect can secrete this thing around it, which is a plant growth hormone similar enough to cause the plant to continue to grow around it to create an even better home for the insect to live within and to feed on. Gulls can be found on every single part of the plant, from the leaves to the buds to the branches, and there are even quite a few cryptic gulls that are found on roots, where if you're not physically pulling the plant up, you're never going to find them because they crawled all the way down in the soil and laid their eggs on it. And why would an insect go through all this trouble to live within a plant? The answer is living within the plant offers some great advantages that can really only be experienced by living deep within these plants, and has caused a lot of convergent evolution to favor it. The main benefit is it's relatively safe. The insects are tiny, and the world is pretty big, and there are a lot of things that eat tiny little insects. And so especially when the larvae are small, they're living within their own food source, like living in a gingerbread house. They can just walk over to the wall, they can have a snack, and they're good to go. It also gives them a safe place to develop within because a predator most likely can't get in. Sometimes it does happen, especially in the middle of winter. You'll have like chickadees and downies that'll go and they'll find the insects living within them. And there are also another category of insects called hyperparasitoids, which are parasites of a parasite, which are a parasitic wasp that somehow finds the gull, lays its eggs inside, and then the little wasp larvae eat the other larvae within the gull. So they're relatively safe, except for some occasions because every time you make one hard rule in nature, nature figures out a way to go around it. The other reason you might want to live within a gull is the plant fibers are really, really tough. And living within them creates a really humid environment too. If you're a tiny little larva, one of your most dangerous things is the changing of the temperature and humidity, because you can pretty easily dry out and turn into a shriveled husk. Living within these plants gives you the perfect micro-ecosystem that's always humid, and it tempers all of the sun coming in that could dry you out because you're hidden in the dark within this plant. And so it gives them not only protection from predators and a food source, but protection from the natural environment as well. So it's a great place to live within this plant. So we've now looked at what a gull is, but there are many other things that you can find on a plant. We're going to move into, of the gulls, burls, and brooms, the next couple things of burls and then into brooms. We've got a great example as you're leaving the Nature Center here of burls right on the porch. And I'd really like when you head out after the program to check those out because it's a very well done piece of art. So what is a burl? A burl is pretty similar to a gull, except it's a hard woody growth within the plant. They're pretty similar to tumors, if you think about it, it's almost like a pearl as well, where something gets into the tree initially and it causes a little bit of an irritation. And the tree then grows a little bit of protection around it. And then the next year, it grows again around that, and it slowly is encapsulating everything in year after year after year, adding layers and layers and layers of this big bulbous thing around whatever caused the initial infection. They're most often caused by injuries, bacteria, or viruses, but most of the time it's impossible to actually know what caused the initial infection because it was sometimes decades ago. A great example, again, are the spruce burls that we see on the spruce trees around here at Chik-Wauk and the North Shore. We suspect it's some sort of agrobacterium, but they've never actually been able to figure out what induces them. And so, you know, it's a suspected inducer, but it's technically an undescribed, unknown species that we routinely see in our everyday lives. And because, you know, it's not something that causes a lot of damage to most major, you know, like lumber production, it's pretty easy to overlook. And so it's pretty funny once you start to think about it, where you're like, oh yeah, we figured out most things and we can ID most things. Here in northern Minnesota, there are quite a few undescribed gulls, burls, and brooms that as you go out now, because your eyes are going to be open to them, you will come across many undescribed and unknown species. Burls are really favored in woodworkers. A great example, again, is right here at Chik-Wauk. It's because they have some pretty wild and unpredictable patterns. They often have swirls and knots and bumps, and the grain inside is really pretty, again from that growth very similar to a pearl over the years. The patterns make them very popular with woodworkers. I've used them before in the past. They're really fun to turn, as well as they make really beautiful coffee tables. But it also makes them quite valuable, and there's actually a really large problem, especially when you get into larger trees, with people poaching all of the burls off of them. And because there's such a large, like tumor-like growth on the plant, often when they get poached and cut off while the tree is still alive, it ends up killing the plant. And so if anyone's a woodworker, please make sure you're, you know, following proper guidelines to source your burls from a respectable source. And I was mentioning a little bit about the poaching. I don't have too much to say about this other than just make sure you're following, you know, reputable sources. But some of them are really more interesting than others, where like when you get into mountain ashes, especially down right along Lake Superior, when they die and I've gotten to look inside of them, they've got really funky, really cool patterns in them, where some of the ones like on the spruces you see around here, you know, they're huge and you expect them to be really cool. They're just almost like rings of an onion, where there's giant, you know, growth rings around them, but they don't have a lot of swirls at them. I often find my burls, if I follow after a logger, you know, they'll cut them off because they don't find them valuable. And so I'll go through like a logging slash afterwards. Sometimes, you know, you have to hike a mile or two out with a big burl, which is a little bit exciting, but you can often find them that way. So we've done gulls, we've done burls. What are brooms? Brooms, also short for witches' brooms, are kind of gull-adjacent growths. They kind of look like someone stuck a broom within a plant, especially high on the balsam firs. We see them a lot in the balsam firs up here around Chik-Wauk. They're normally caused by a fungus. They can be caused by a plasmid, which is pretty similar to a bacteria, but some of them can also be caused by gull mites. And they're generally just a big proliferation of twigs. Gulls, burls, brooms, and that brings us to our last funky category of non-metazoan plant diseases. Non-metazoan plant diseases is just a funny, fancy way of saying a non-insect caused plant disease. So in short, it's fungal or, you know, bacterial or viral, but especially common are the rusts, which cause bright rusty orange spores to erupt out of the plants. This means that some gulls, burls, and brooms are non-metazoan plant diseases, but not all of them. Very similar to how sometimes a square is considered a rectangle, but not all rectangles are considered squares. And there are a few gull-adjacent critters that you're going to come across once you start looking for them. One of the most common ones that I find are the scale insects, and they're kind of like barnacles of the plant world. They're a little like aphid sort of thing that has a hard shell. As they grow into adulthood, they choose one spot that they hunker down, and they adhere to the plant, and they just start sucking juices out of the plant, and they stay in that spot through the rest of their life. You'll also come across quite a few leaf miners. I won't cover leaf miners today because that's its whole huge own category. And leaf miners are little insects, often either flies or moths, that live in between the layers of a leaf, and they cause all of these mines as they go through them, and they often leave behind stripes of frass, another fancy word for insect poop in them. The one that I find the most common and the prettiest is the aspen serpentine leaf miner that you'll find on the quaking aspens up here, especially as we move into like early to mid-summer. So we've got gulls, we've got burls, we've got brooms, we've got all of the things, but how do you find them? They're everywhere. No matter where you go, now that you know, you're going to have a slightly slower natural amble as you go through the woods, because every time you start to look at them or look for them, you're going to find them. You just have to learn to recognize them. It's very similar to looking for agates. Your first couple times out, you walk through, you maybe find a couple of those, elite agates that are only for the best hunters that are like that big, and then your friend follows behind you and finds the large agates, and you're like, oh, how did I miss that? I had to literally walk over it. Your brain just hasn't been hardwired to learn to look for them. And so as you learn to look for them, you'll get better and better at picking them out, and then pretty soon, again, you'll be able to walk through the woods, and you'll never be able to go faster because you're just going to keep finding them. So once you find them, how do you ID them? How do you dive into the deeper, more difficult part of what did you find? The first step is you're going to have to identify the host plant. Gull-inducing organisms are really wildly host-specific. Not only do they like one species generally, sometimes you can find them on both red maple and sugar maple, but generally you'll find them only on one species of plant. They also only like one particular part of that species of plant. So you might only find them on the leaves, or you may only find them on the twigs or on the branches, that sort of thing. Once you then have that host plant figured out, look at the location, because like I mentioned, they like one specific spot within that plant. And so, great example here, we can see on the sugar maple, we've got these little fingers that are sticking out of the leaf. That species is only found on maples. I've only seen them on sugar maple, so I've read reports of them on red maple as well, but I've never seen it. Which, sometimes when you're getting into the really deep ID, you start to question when you see one report of it once on something, did someone actually find it on that, or were they just bad IDing their host plant that one time? But they only like to lay their eggs on the top surfaces even of the maple leaves. They won't lay them on the bottom, they'll just lay them on the top. So we've ID'd our host plant, we've ID'd the location on the plant. Now we're going to get into some of the general types of gulls. You can roughly kind of group them together by looking at either the organism's form on the outside and what shape they make the gull, or what the insect looks like inside. And these are some of our really big categories. We've got gull midges right over here. We've got gull mites. We also have gull wasps. We've got some gull flies. We've got oak gull wasps. And then aphids and fungus somehow flipped, and I'm not quite sure how that happened. But so we'll also have aphids and fungus that we'll get into. Gull midges are the most common type of gull-inducing organism that you can find. They might live singly in one chamber within one big gull, or sometimes they live with many of them living within one large gull, each in individual chambers. Sometimes you have a really unique situation where, like this one, which you can find on the chokecherry, they'll have a whole bunch of them living within one single chamber, which is very interesting and different than most other gull midges. Another really wild part about the midges is most of them don't live their entire life within the gull. They'll go through their first kind of like sets of growth, similar to a caterpillar, and then once they're ready for the cocoon or like pupa stage, they'll chew their way out through the gull, drop to the soil below, and then they'll pupate in the soil. And so you might be able to find, the little tiny ones living within the plant, but if you don't catch them at the right time, they're really hard to get the adult out of it because the adult does something down in the soil and then hatches the next year in the spring. Also pretty wild, I won't say all, but more or less every type of plant that you come across, especially out in the prairie and up here in northern Minnesota, has some sort of gull midge that forms a gull on them, somewhere within the plant. Again, it could be in the roots, and so you may never see it, but it's very commonly on the roots. A great example up here is we have all of the lowbush honeysuckle. And there's a midge that likes to feed and live within the actual fruit itself, causes it to blow up and look a little bit like a banana. However, you can only find that after, the fruit starts to form, late summer to like early fall, before those fruits kind of fall off and disappear. And so if you don't know what to look for, it's pretty easy to have this thing that's incredibly common disappear and you won't even know that it exists around you. We also have gull wasps. Gull wasps generally form multi-chambered gulls, and inside they've got small white larvae. The midges are always orange. Sometimes they're lightly yellowish, but they're always orange. The wasps are always white, and they generally live within multi-chambered gulls. Great example is right over here in the middle. And then one that you've probably come across before is this one on the blueberries. The larvae, very different from the midges, they overwinter. And so they live within the gull all winter. They produce crazy compounds in their body that act very similar to antifreeze to keep them from freezing in the winter without any sort of insulation. They just sit down and they hunker there for the entire winter with really high concentrations of sugars within their body so they don't freeze and explode. Then in the spring, they chew their way out and they emerge to go find their new host. If you come across one of them kind of late spring, as all the snow is melting, I'd really recommend grabbing a jar, putting it inside to just see what happens. They need very little oxygen, and so there's way more than enough oxygen in a mason jar for you to have an insect living within them and hatch out. But most of the time, the only way you're going to see these gull wasps as an adult is by putting them in a jar in the spring and waiting to see what happens and waiting to see what emerges. We do have one very special category of the gull wasps, which are the oak gull wasps. I'm throwing this one in because there are a few oaks up here in the boundary waters, both bur oaks and northern red oaks, as well as a couple pin oaks. But when you go other places, oak gull wasps are one of the most common types of gulls that you can come across. Throughout the entire, northern US area, up into Canada and down into Mexico, there are over 800 different species of gull wasps found within North America, with more being described every single year. Another pretty cool thing about them is they've got super weird life cycles where they have 2 different generations, sometimes, most of the time, every year. The first generation will hatch out in the spring, and they're very cryptic gulls. They're very tiny, really generally impossible to find unless you get really lucky, and that is an asexual generation of only females. They've overwintered in these buds, or twigs or little corky ridges. They hatch out in the spring, then they find a new place to lay their eggs and start the second generation, which is a sexual generation that produces both males and females. They then mate, lay their eggs in a new location, and then the next generation again will hatch out in the spring, being only the asexual female generation. How that evolved is pretty wild. No one's got any solid concrete idea, but it's really fascinating to think about that they not only induce different gulls that look very different on different parts of the plant during the 2 different life cycles, but that they have such a unique life cycle that has 2 different generations within it that are sexual and asexual.
Will those happen simultaneously in the same year?
Yes.
Plants?
Yeah, so right as leaf out happens, you'll have the first generation that hatches out for the asexual one, and then you'll never have them coincide though. And so then the females will find a place to lay their eggs. Then midsummer to late summer, the second generation with both males and females will hatch out. So they always happen both within the year, but you never see them at the same time. And then to make things more complicated, because nature doesn't like boxes, you'll have one genus that almost every single species will have 2 generations of asexual and sexual, but then some of them will only have sexual generations, some species, and some species will only have asexual generations. So, everything gets a little bit more complicated the deeper in you dive. We also have the gull flies. Oh, yes?
Do these wasps sting?
No, they don't sting. Generally, they just use their ovipositor for being able to inject their eggs within the plant. And so, when you think about a wasp, their stingers are modified ovipositors for, yellow jackets and bumblebees and that sort of thing. And so these wasps, I don't believe they can sting, but, they're small enough, I think it'd be really hard if you were to find one for them to actually, sting where you could feel it. I don't think they sting unless you're a plant. Gull flies generally form one very large single gull within the middle of a plant stem. This is the one that most people are familiar with when they see gulls, especially the ones that you find on goldenrods, like here in the middle. We also have the adult that you can hatch out in the spring, and they've got these beautiful kind of cream-colored spots on their wings, which are really cool. Another one that's slowly moving north, and it's very interesting to watch, is one on the invasive bull thistle or Canadian thistle. A fly kind of was introduced to maybe help with, some sort of population control, or it just got here naturally. No one's quite sure. But a couple years ago, I noticed it show up in Duluth, and now I've seen it a little bit close to harbors. So eventually, I expect within the next 5 to 10 years, it can end up all the way up to, like Grand Marais and over towards Chik-Wauk. But we don't particularly have large concentrations of the Canadian or bull thistle up here. But I really would invite you to watch for them, because they are slowly creeping north as they're finding these populations of thistles that have never interacted with them. We have gull mites, and gull mites are a hard category to get into because they've got 4 different general forms. The first form that they have are the velvet or the urinium gull mites. You'll most often see them up here on the alders, where they form these really bright patches of velvety material on the underside of the leaf. You do have some that really like red maples that will form these really intense pink spots on the top of them, but so those are our velvet gull mites. We also have the bead or the pouch gulls, which form what looks like someone took a bunch of beads and beaded them onto the top of the leaf. We have finger gulls, which are sometimes called spindle gulls as well, which look like fingers sticking out of the top of a leaf. And then lastly, we have a weird grouping of bud brooms, where the mite lives within the bud, chews on it and feeds on it, and causes this huge proliferation of all of the buds, causing this little chunky, lumpy, wild looking, conglomeration of buds all stuck together. We do also have aphids, which like to cause some gulls and some pseudo-gulls on quite a few of the plants up here. They generally form these hollow balloon-like gulls that have really thin sides, and when you crack them open, on the inside you'll find that they're full of these waxy secretions. The aphids that cause them are generally in the woolly aphid group, meaning that they have these woolly, waxy secretions on top of them that make them almost look like little tiny sheets. And sometimes you'll run into kind of a pseudo-gull, such as this very far one on the side, which is on an elm, which is caused by a woolly aphid that feeds on the elm and causes it to curl, and that one's called the elm leaf curl aphids. And almost every elm that you find along the streams, especially into the boundary waters and right here on the edge along the Gunflint Trail, will have at least one of those formations caused by those little aphids feeding on the elm leaves. Really interesting is when you crack them open and you see all of that waxy secretion, it came off of the aphids. And for years, people didn't know why they would fill their gulls with these waxy secretions. And we're still not completely positive, but what's become the most likely explanation at the moment is they think they fill the extra space in the gull to act as insulation. And so by having all of this fluffy, powdery stuff on the inside, it's suspected that it really helps moderate temperature changes, because your leaf might be being heated up by the sun, and if you're in direct sun midday versus no sun at night, you're still going to have some pretty extreme temperature variations within that. It also helps to have places where humidity can latch onto, and so if it gets too humid, it can be absorbed into all of this fluffy, cottony stuff. When it dries out, it'll slowly release it. And so they think that the fluffy secretions inside help to control both temperature and humidity, such as someone insulating their house, which is pretty fascinating. One of the last groups we'll get into are the funguses. Funguses are those non-metazoan plant diseases which cause quite a few variations of different forms of stuff found on plants. The fungal galls are often caused by rusts, which have these bright orange spores. You'll see them most likely up here on these big lumpy galls that you find on jack pines. They've got big burls on them on the branches, and then in the spring, if you catch them in like a 2-week window, they'll have all of these bright orange spores that erupt out of them. But you can also have ones that cause these very lumpy tendrils that like to creep out of them, especially on like the junipers up here. One of my favorite places on one of the outlooks over in the Boundary Waters. You climb up this big hill and there are a bunch of junipers up there, and in the spring they have this fungal disease called tongues of fire, and it grows all of these bright orange tongues out of the stems of the juniper that are very showy for about 2 or 3 days, and then they're gone for the rest of the year. They also sometimes form little pockets or little circles, and every once in a while you'll find like a dome, and if you flip it on like the backside, there won't be anything inside. The gull mites sometimes form a little dome. When you flip it over, it's got that velvet on the inside, where if you flip over a dome or like a blister shaped thing on a leaf and there's nothing there, it's going to be caused by a fungus. We also have some miscellaneous gull-inducing organisms, which are pretty common up here. Moths generally form pretty large oblong gulls, and most importantly for IDing them is they have this little tiny exit hole in them. The little tiny exit hole, they chew in as they're going in, and then they create a bunghole, the actual true name for it, by grabbing little bits of the inside of the gull, little bits of frass, their own poop, and their silk, and they shove that in the exit hole and make a little trap door out of it until they're ready to leave, and then they pull their door open and re-emerge into the outside world as a moth. We also have adelgids, which up here we generally find them on spruces, particularly the pineapple one, which the pineapple gull adelgid causes in the spring slightly pink, but then aging into green, and then lastly dark brown little pineapples on the end of your spruce like branches and twigs. We also have some psyllids, and so if any of you are from further south or are down around like the cities, the psyllids really love hackberries, and they form all sorts of gulls all over hackberries, and every tree you look at will have hundreds of gulls on it from the psyllids. And lastly, we've got one weird group, the Harmandiola. They form gulls on aspens and poplars, and they're really, really common, but 95% of them are undescribed. And so if you go for a walk and you come across an aspen that has some sort of little leaf gull on it, I can almost guarantee you that those are undescribed and unknown species, and just no one's working on them right now. And so you find them and you go, oh cool, look at that, that doesn't match anything. And then you don't have anything else to do with it other than hope that someone will get into it eventually. And so now we've done gulls, burls, brooms, non-metazoan plant diseases. We've done our general groups, where to find them and how to ID them. And now we're going to get into some of their common names. So their common names follow a general formula because they were generally named by common people who like to describe things by stringing adjectives together. And so there's a rough format, it doesn't always work, that you can use to help figure out what gulls you're looking at. The general format involves IDing first the host species, then your location on the gull or the shape of the gull. This one kind of varies a little bit more. Then you add in the word gull, and lastly you add in the type of inducer, such as wasp, midge, that sort of thing.
So they use common name for host species or scientific name?
It varies.
Okay.
So both.
Yeah.
So sometimes you'll even get like a cultivar name in there, where you might end up with something that's on an arborvitae, where we all think of it as cedars, but it has the cultivar name within there. So we'll do a couple bits of practice here, and as we work through it, the names will appear, and then we'll have one in the end that we'll see if you all can guess. So right now, we've got a willow, and where would you say this gull over here is found on the willow? Leaf, bud, branch, twig, where would you all say? Bud, and then what would you say it looks like? Raspberry, pine cone, all these possible things. And so, we know it's on a willow. We decided it looks a little bit like a pine cone, gull, and this one's caused by a little midge. And so this is our willow, pine cone, gull, midge. We've got another one here. This one is found on an ash tree. We especially see it up here on the black ashes in the middle of winter. As you're driving around, you'll see all of those lumpy brown and black things on the black ashes in the swamps. And that is a gull. So, we've got our lumpy black things, or brown things. They're found on the kind of the flowers. And what would you say it looks like? Yeah, kind of a dead flower. I've heard cauliflower before. All sorts of different descriptors. And so we have our host, which is an ash tree. It's found on the flowers, and then it's caused by one of those gull mites in that bud proliferation group. And so this one is the ash flower gull mite. But sometimes it gets a little bit trickier. So here we have one that's pretty commonly found on white oaks further south in the state. It's either found on white or bur oaks. And then what would you say it looks like, or what's the location?
It's like a bird.
Yeah, it looks like a burr or a stem. And so they're found on white oaks, but they call it hedgehog. Someone decided it looks like a hedgehog. And so, you know, you think you've got it figured out. You're like, all right, we've got white oak. Hedgehog? Okay. Gull. It's caused by a wasp. But they don't include the common name for what it's found on. And so this one is commonly referred to as a hedgehog gull wasp. We've got another one here that we see all the time up here around Chik-Wauk on the balsam firs. So it's found on balsam firs. It looks like a giant broom. It's a gull. It's a rust fungus. And so the general name is the fir broom rust fungus. And so, you know, it generally follows that format, but there's a little bit of variation within it. But this can also lead to some really ridiculous, silly names. And this happens to be my favorite common name of any species I've ever come across, because we've got an example sitting over on the table. It's literally only at its longest, about that long, maybe a quarter of an inch. And it's found on the pseudocones of the tag alders or the swamp alders. But it's only found in the eastern United States. There's a different species in the western United States, different species in Alaska, and a different species that essentially look the same but are genetically different over in Russia. And so this is the Eastern American alder. Someone decided it looks like a tongue, especially early in the year when they're pink, sticking out of those cones. Tongue, gull, and it's a fungus. So this is the Eastern American alder tongue gull fungus, gull. Try to say that 5 times fast. But, you know, you can also just kind of give them a common name, and most people will be like, you're making that up. There's no way that that's the common name. And you go, well, it was named by common people. Common people like very descriptive names, like brown-headed cowbird, bird that has brown head, hangs out around cows. And so a lot of the gull names are very nicely descriptive to help you ID them. So we've gone through them for what they are, where you find them, how to ID them. And I've got a few of the most common ones that you'll find here in northern Minnesota that we'll go through. And then if anyone likes, we'll go through this part kind of fast so we can have a little bit of question and answer in the end. So here's some of the most common gulls you're going to come across in northern Minnesota. The first one, I guarantee you all have seen this, is black knot. Black knot is a fungal infection that's found on the prunuses. So all of the different cherries you find here, as well as some of like the cultivar plums and that sort of thing. And it causes these large black lumps on the twigs. I've sometimes heard people refer to them as the raccoon poop fungus because they've decided it looks like a raccoon has pooped on the twig. But this is one of my favorite ones to come across because everyone has seen it and they go, oh, I've always wondered what that is, but I've never known. And so we've got black knot. Another really common one that everyone has seen, but not everyone knows the name of, is the goldenrod gull fly. And those are the ping-pong-sized balls that you find in the middle of the goldenrod stem. These, again, are really easy to grow out, very similar to the gull wasps. If you all have any grandkids, I would really recommend in the spring having them go out with you and gather a bunch of them, stick them in a jar and put them on the windowsill. You'll forget about them, but they won't. And every once in a while, they'll wander over and look at it, and then one day they'll all of a sudden come over and they're like, oh, look, there's something in it. And they'll have hatched out, and you'll be able to not only see the adult, but it's a really nice, easy science experiment to do with your kids to see what comes out of them. I've also heard people really like to use these for fishing bait. I've never tried them myself. And very funny side note about them is I've heard people who have eaten them before. And they specifically note, because they produce large amounts of sugar in them, that in the winter and the fall, they're very sweet. But if you eat them earlier in the year, they're quite bitter. I've not personally tried it myself. If you'd like to, you can try it out on your own. But it'd be interesting to actually know if you could taste those sugars in it, or if it just tastes like, you know, the bitter plant that it's feeding on.
Put the whole thing on a hook.
They'll crack it open, kind of like this one here in the middle. And then you can't really see it well in this one, but right there, there's a little white larva that looks like a wax worm. and they'll grab that out to throw in.
What part of it do you eat?
Inside, it's really hard to see, but right in there's a little white larva that looks like a wax
Are
one.
they sweet?
Supposedly, I've never tried it.
What
It's
about
a-
the gall itself?
Ooh, I have bit some of those open before when I forgot a knife to show them off, and those are generally bitter. I don't know if it's a defense mechanism where they try to concentrate bitter, compounds around it so it's less likely to be eaten. But I have watched, I lived out in Montana for a little bit. The pronghorn would specifically in the winter eat the gulls that were on the sages. Like they'd be grazing and they'd very particularly eat the gulls that were on the top. I don't know if it's because, they're bigger so you got more for your mouthful, if there's a little bit of protein in them or if they just tasted different. I've also watched very young porcupines and aspens where they're really like succulent gulls choose individual leaves off of an aspen to eat the obviously gulled leaf. And again, maybe it's a little juicier because it's kind of succulent. Maybe they've learned that there's just a little bit more protein in it and they don't know what they're after, but the ones that are just willing to eat them do a little bit better. Or maybe that was just an odd little porcupine that was like, I don't know, this tastes different, I'll eat these instead. So sometimes organisms do specifically eat them, which is interesting to watch. Another common one that you'll see very often in the winter here, especially if you're driving down towards Duluth along the highway there, is black leaf. Black leaf can be found on all of the different like amel chairs or Juneberries, Saskatoons, service berries, whatever you call them. It causes these really dark black fungal spores on the backside of the leaf, and it causes this big witch's broom that likes to hang off of the plant. And you most commonly see them in the winter because you see a large black clump of leaves in the woods and you go, huh, that's pretty showy and distinct. And it turns out that it's a fungus called black leaf. If you live near oaks, one of the most common gulls you'll see is the oak leaf gull midge. It causes all of these little blistery, warty things all over the top of oak leaves. One that people ask about all the time because they see it on all of their cultivar stuff in their yard are the juniper apple rusts. Normally, throughout the year, they look like someone stuck a golf ball, in the middle of your twig, but every once in a while, for only a short window in the spring, generally after really hard spring rains, you'll have all of these bright orange tongues that erupt out of the gull, release spores, and then they shrivel up and die. Rusts are really wild in their life cycle because often they need a secondary host that is nowhere related to the initial host they're growing on. So like this one, the juniper apple rust, they need a juniper, which includes eastern red cedar, and they also need an apple. And these plants can often be 10 to 15 miles away. The spore will be released in the morning when the winds will carry it till it finds a dewdrop sitting on an apple leaf. It happens to land in that dewdrop, forms a little infection on the leaf, which then grows little tendrils out of it, which again, in the morning, have to be blown by the wind to find a dewdrop sitting on a small little part of a juniper to land on to continue the life cycle. How that happens, I've got no idea. The amount of luck involved in them has to be astronomically small. Again, if you're from a little closer to the cities or have a house down there, go to visit grandkids or something like that, you'll come across the hackberry nipple gall psyllids. They're really common on the underside of hackberries, and you'll often see hundreds, if not thousands of them on the hackberry tree above you. Not truly a gull, but kind of gull adjacent because you notice them as you're looking for them, are the woolly alder aphids. You can also find these on the alders. They're starting to come out now, but you'll particularly see them around deer season, where there's all of these little hairy critters all stuck together on like the bark of an alder. Right now, as they're starting to emerge, they look like this, where they're gray and they have all of these tiny little speckles, where they haven't quite grown out their fuzz. But when you watch them, they all dance and sway together in this little group, which they use to confuse all the predators that might come to get them. They're particularly fond of, yellow jackets are particularly fond of them when they switch over from nectars to kind of meats in late summer, early fall. And so generally all of their waving and dancing, which you can watch, is to try to make sure that predators leave them alone. Another one that you find very rarely up here in the boundary waters, but when you find the bur oaks, you generally find them, are the oak rough bullet gull wasp. They form these kind of nipple-shaped gulls on the oak tree, and really interestingly, they have a really cool like symbiotic relationship with ants, where at the very end of these, at the little point, they secrete really sweet sugary liquids that the ants then go to and they eat. And it's thought that the gulls secrete all of this sugary liquid to help get the ants there, so the ants will chase off all sorts of, wasps and other things that might eat them, very similar to how ants like to garden aphids. Again, another wild evolutionary path that developed, and there are quite a few different oak gull wasps that do secrete little bits of sugary substances to convince ants to come and farm them and protect them. If you have buckthorn, we're starting to see a great issue with buckthorn, and there's this common rust that likes to attack the buckthorn, both the berries and the leaves. And this one, it's kind of funky because it's within a complex where there are like 4 or 5 different subspecies that all do it, but it's really nice to see that we have an invasive species that has no natural predators. Now that the rust has gotten here, it's starting to be able to run away and cause massive devastations within these populations, because the populations haven't had to deal with rusts in really generally their entire life. And so now that it's here, it's causing a lot of damage to them, which is pretty nice.
Has it moved to other plants that rust, or is that specific?
Yes and no. It needs 2 different hosts, and it generally goes in between a grass and then buckthorn. The most common one goes in between smooth brome and buckthorn. It doesn't do a lot of damage to smooth brome, but it does some. And so some people don't like it because they use smooth brome for a lot of haying. But once you go further west, smooth brome is really invasive, and so they don't particularly mind that something is going after the invasive grass and the invasive buckthorn. Goldenrods also, you'll often see it in the fall, will have these bunch gulls in them, which cause the plant to think it's growing up, but they've stopped it from growing up, so it keeps sending out all of these leaves, and they form a little rosette, or what looks like a rose, sitting on top of the goldenrod, also known as a bunch gull because it's a bunch of leaves. This one is caused by the goldenrod bunch gull midge, but there are a couple other very similar species that will cause these little bunches of gulls on top of goldenrods. One that I invite you to start looking for now is the American tar spot. It likes all of the maples, particularly sugar maple, but you can find some different species on red maples as well, and there's a different species found on the mountain maples up here. But it causes these really wild fungal infections, little tiny spots that are dark black, and then when you zoom in on them with your phone or with a microscope, they look like a brain in texture. This one, again, you find pretty commonly where you find bur oaks, and it doesn't have a common name, and so I gave it one. And this common name that I gave it, because it's in layers of pink and white and pink or bright pink, sometimes just white, but it looks like lumps of cotton candy that you get from the fair stuck on the leaf. And so I've named this one the cotton candy oak gull wasp. We mentioned this one very briefly when we were looking at funguses, where you've got the pine oak rust gull fungus burls. When you have an oak, they cause these tiny little fingers to grow out of the oak leaf on the bottom, but where you see them more often are on the jack pines. And on the jack pines, they cause these very distinctive woody burls that will persist for many years after the tree dies. But when you're going to find them, they make great clubs if you're a child, or like a wizard wand. For many years, I dressed as a wizard for Halloween, and I had one from a really burly tree on the farm that I turned into a wizard staff that looked pretty cool. Again, with oaks, one of my favorite ones to come across is the spongy oak apple gull wasp. It causes what looks like a little apple to grow on the outside of the oak of the oak leaf. When you crack it open, the inside is filled with almost what looks like foam that you would get from like a flower store to put your flowers in. But there are a couple species where if you crack them open, the inside will look different, where it looks like someone has taken a bunch of spindles and suspended something in the middle. So if you ever come across one, I'd really recommend cracking it open to see what the inside is, because it's like a little mini scavenger hunt. each one that you crack open will be a little bit different.
Does that kill the organism inside when you open it?
If they're green, it would, because then they would lose all the humidity. But most of the time, once they get to brown, the organism has already hatched out and it's already left. And this one, it's really interesting. I've tried to grow them out a lot, and I've been very unsuccessful because I keep getting hyperparasitoids. It's thought that the reason they have so much fluff around them is to try to stop other insects from laying their eggs inside, which then eat the initial like gull inducer. But these ones are wildly common to get, you know, a different thing out of it than the thing that started it. And so I've only successfully reared the adults of this a couple times, but I've probably had 15 to 20 not supposed to be in there insects that emerge. And you go, huh, that's pretty wild. I didn't expect that to be in there. And so these are really common to find hyperparasitoids. This one mentioned already as well with the fur broom rust fungus. In the spring though, if you take a look at them when they first put out their little like green leafy bits, they're going to be covered with all of these little orange spores. Right now we're just at the end where they're starting to die and fall away. And so if you have any by your house right now, I'd recommend going to check it out to see if it looks just like this dead mass of leaves and twigs and stuff, or if you still have a little bit of the, you know, new growth on it.
Can that spread blueberries?
Not this one.
Not this one, okay.
So this one only alternates in between fir trees and another fir tree, but there is one that goes in between blueberries and fir trees. On blueberries, it causes a broom that looks like this. You're welcome to come up and look at it. But it also alternates over to the firs, and so we'll slowly get through all of your blueberries that are within generally about 10 miles of a fir tree. Slowly. The native blueberries do a lot better, where they can, you know, kind of persist and muddle through it for a long time. But a lot of the cultivar blueberries do very poorly once they get the broom rust in it, and they knock off pretty quickly. And I've noticed it's especially common in like portages or around houses. It seems like it needs the little bit extra disturbance, and I would suspect the extra disturbance allows for a little bit more wind to help transfer those spores to the blueberries along like walkways and that sort of thing. But that's a good point, where you do see that one very commonly in blueberries, but you almost never see it within the actual fir itself. And I think I actually might have an example of what it looks like in the fir over here, if you'd like to come up and look at it afterwards. It's very, very minuscule, and this one is only on like one little branch. I'm going to skip a couple of these just, you know, for time. One that you'll also see up here pretty commonly is the dwarf mistletoe. So as you're going along all of the bogs that have the black spruces in them, you'll see all of these lumpy, bumpy things that almost look like truffula trees sticking out of, you know, the spruces that are all around it. One of my favorite ones is over on Poplar Lake. You can see it from all the way across the lake as you're heading towards the Liz Portage. There's this beautiful, like truffula looking tree, huge round top on it, and then a skinny stick that comes down of it. And those are all caused by the eastern dwarf mistletoe. And if you get up close and personal with them, they have all of these bright red and yellow little plants that are growing out of the actual tree itself. And this one has a wild mechanism to help it spread, where they have explosive charges essentially within the plant. And so a bird comes down, touches it, the seeds explode out and they're sticky, gets stuck to the bird's feet. The bird flies away, lands in a new spruce tree, you know, looking for more cones or seeds to munch on, and moves the, you know, exploding seed with a little bit of sticky goop to the next tree. It sticks on that and spreads the infection that way.
Does it kill the tree?
Depends. Some trees have a little bit weaker immune systems, some are a little bit stronger. Most of the time, you just end up with a tree that has all of these big brooms on it, which is a pretty like detrimental draw on them. And I've noticed ones that have really large infections generally produce significantly less cones. Or if you're in like a black spruce bog that has a really hard like infection from the mistletoe, you don't get many cones out of it. But you know, it's a natural part of the ecosystem that's naturally evolved, and you know, lots of other like insects and birds like to nest in all of these brooms, and so it might not be the greatest for the host tree that it's on, but it does play a very large role in the other ecosystems for stuff using it. This one was one of the ones that really got me into gulls as well. Is on thimbleberries, you'll see those little hooked, bumpy, lumpy bits, and that is a thimbleberry gull wasp. This one has a surprising amount of controversy around it because over in like the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, people first began noticing them in the 80s. And so someone did a scientific paper which ended with the line that, summarizing it, they weren't sure if it was native or it was always there, but people were starting to notice it and more research was needed. People misread that and decided that it meant that because they were seeing it for the first time, it wasn't that they were just learning to look for it, that it was a non-native species that had been introduced and was ruining their thimbleberry crop. We've done a lot more research recently, including a couple papers that have come out in like 2011, and I've sent samples into a researcher pretty recently, and all of our thimbleberry gull wasps are really genetically distinct and unique from all the ones that you find further west. Just like our adjunct thimbleberries that you would normally find in the mountains out west. They're pretty weird around Lake Superior. And so it's a native population that has lived here ever since the glaciers left. Pretty isolated, they've got really weird genetics because of it. But many people think because of some misread research that came out in the 80s that it's a non-native species here. All right, so that's about all I have. I'd like to open it up for a little bit of questions. If you'd like to take a picture or anything, there are also some great resources that exist right now. If you're into using like websites, there's a really great one that was put together by a group of naturalists, mainly during COVID, called Gull Formers. If you go on to Gull Formers, they have an ID section, and so you can put in like your host plants. If you see it on like a red maple, you can type in red maple, and it gives you a drop-down menu of like where was this gull found, of the leaf, bud, top of the leaf, bottom of the leaf, anywhere on the plant, and then it will give you a list of stuff that is known to exist on them, including undescribed and unknown species that we've documented, but no one has actually formally described the adult. If you use iNaturalist, I'd really recommend checking out the iNaturalist projects for gulls of Minnesota or gulls of the North Woods. If you've never used iNaturalist before, it uses a little bit of like AI where you take a picture of a plant and it will give you a possible suggestion from what other people have ID'd nearby for what it thinks it is. It's gotten a lot better recently with gulls, mainly because there have been people who have been IDing gulls on it, but it will generally pull up something that's relatively close, and then I monitor the projects a little bit less frequently in the summer, because summer gets busy and runs away from you. But in the middle of winter, I go through and ID a lot of the gulls on there. Does anyone have any other questions? Yes.
How many black knot fungus on a cherry tree before it can kill it?
That one varies because of, if you think of black cherries as like humans as a population, some have a stronger immune system, some have weaker immune systems, and some trees do a little bit better with the infections or some do a little bit worse. Generally, if it is just on like the periphery branches, it doesn't kill the tree. But unless it's a black cherry, once it gets to the actual trunk itself, it will end up killing the tree.
Okay. Do crab apples get affected by the black knot?
They don't. It only affects generally like the cherries and the plums. And so apples can sometimes get other diseases. Most commonly they'll get like a sun scald that will get all like lumpy and weird because it will get other like fungal infections that get into that, which it can look kind of similar to black knot, but it won't get black knot.
Thank you.
Yeah. Great. I can flip through a couple of these as well if you'd just like to see the last couple ones. I know it's time to go. If anyone would like to take a little walk around Chik-Wauk to just look for some out and about, I'll do a really quick, like 15-minute hike that just kind of goes around the main area here as we look for stuff. Feel free to stop me if there are any slides that you'd like to dive into a little bit more.
If you were to take a leaf that has those little things all over it and put it in a jar, would you do that?
Most of them, no. So a lot of them, like just midges, if you could look at them underneath a microscope, you'd be able to see them. But most of them are tiny little microscopic midges, or sorry, not midges, mites. They do undergo pretty Herculean adventures in the fall, where they leave their little leaf and they crawl all the way back to a bud, crawl inside the bud scale, and then they live there over winter until the spring when everything leaves out. And then they undergo, again, a Herculean journey for, you know, a microscopic critter to crawl inches or even feet sometimes to get to a new leaf to start their home. Most of these, like individual gulls like this, will only have one mite living within them. They're generally solitary. But the ones that are like the velvet mites are big colonies that are all living together in that like fluffy, velvety bit. Oh, very important note. And that's all I have for you all.
I identify Carolyn's house.
Ah, Carol's got the goldenrod gull fly earrings on right now. Very stylish.
Oh, that's what did someone make them? Are they actual gulls? They're actual gulls.
I can't remember his last name, but there's an artist in Duluth. His name is Terry, who does like wood cookie earrings and also does some out of like acorns, and did those round out of the goldenrod gull fly gulls.